40 minutes. So in this talk, I've cut the number of slides I have to present down to 4. I think if I do one every 10 minutes, we should be okay. So on the agenda today, I'm going to go through just a little bit of getting started with the Grails source code. So that's the Grails sources, how to check out the project and just do some basics, get set up. And then I'm going to go through a visual in IDE walkthrough of the Grails code base, and I'll talk to you the key bits, how stuff fits together. We'll go along, I'll go through this is really an open-ended talk, so if we get enough time to talk about every single aspect, which I doubt will be internals of Grails, we'll just go there. Otherwise, we'll talk about what we can, we'll be open for questions at any time. Stop me at any time if you have a question, and we'll just deal with this in a kind of open-ended fashion and see where we go. So first of all, how to get started with the Grails source code. So the Grails sources are hosted on GitHub, like pretty much every major open source project nowadays. So all you have to do is go ahead and clone the repository into your local, wherever you keep your source codes or whatever, and just clone them, and then create a local install. And that's typically a matter of cd into your local clone, running Gradle install. You don't actually have to have Gradle installed, you can just use the Gradle wrapper. Then all you have to do is set the Grails home environment variable to where you created your clone, and add the bin directory to your path. Yeah, so the Grails home. And then you have a development version of Grails up and running. Yeah. If you want to make this easier in terms of switching between versions, there is a GVM, Groovy Environment Manager, which allows you to link local versions of Grails so you can have development versions of Grails with GVM and switch between a development version and a normal version of Grails quite easily. So I recommend using GVM if you're going to be doing a lot of switching between Grails versions. Once you've got the source code, it's all about getting set up in an IDE. Grails, Grails code base is a mix of Java and Groovy mainly, so you will need an IDE. You could code in TextMate, but it might take you a bit longer with the Java stuff. So recommended an IDE. So to set up an IDE, what you do is you run Gradle Eclipse, if you're using Eclipse or SCS or whatever Eclipse-based IDE you're using, or you run Gradle IDEA. And what that'll do is will generate the IDE project files that you need to start working with Grails. Yeah. So you just open up the IntelliJ IPR. And I think in Eclipse you have to import from Workspace or import to Workspace or something, and you can import the project into your Workspace, and that's it. And you're done. Okay, so that's mainly done for my slides. Now we're going to go through the source code walkthrough and get a little bit more interactive in talking about the code base and what it looks like and so on. So the Grails project is essentially a Gradle multi-project build, yeah? So there are a number of subdirectories which split Grails out into different modules, yeah? These make up the jar files that get placed onto your path when you're running your Grails application, yeah? There is some kind of core jar files that are needed by everything, well, needed, not by everything, but they're needed, they're kind of foundational, and those are the Grails hyphen projects. And there are a bunch of Grails hyphen plugin projects, these ones. And those are essentially binary plugins. So you know, since Grails, when did we add binary plugins? Was it Grails 2? We've supported binary plugins, which are pre-compiled plugins. These are essentially binary Grails plugins. And they're the default set of plugins you get when you create a Grails application. So there's plugins for, for example, Grails plugin services is the plugin that deals with wiring together services and making them transactional and setting them up as a bean and so on. Grails plugin, well, that one is gone actually into a separate plugin, non-binary version. Grails plugin URL mappings. This guy is the one that deals with the URL mappings like Groovy file, matching URLs to controllers and actions and so on. So each of these plugin projects add functionality to a Grails application. Yeah. But if you take away these plugins, there is essentially a core runtime. Yeah. And the core runtime is found in the Grails core project. Yeah. So Grails core is where you'll find things like the interfaces for the plugin manager, the interfaces for Grails application, all of the key interfaces that bootstrap a Grails application. Okay, so but before we even have a bootstrap application, there is a project called Grails Bootstrap, which is this guy. Yeah. So Grails Bootstrap is the project which is mainly related to the command line. Yeah. So the Grails command, the interactive mode, when you run Grails space create app or Grails space something, this is all powered by the Grails Bootstrap project. And in here, you'll find all of the key packages that make up the command line interface. So you've got the CLI package, and in here you'll find things like, if you really want to know what happens when Grails space a command is executed, that was all handled by a class called Grails script runner. Yeah. So when you type Grails space whatever, and if you really want to know what happens when the command line arguments are parsed, there's a command line parser and a command line interface, which these are the typical flags where you can specify offload or stack trace or reloading or refresh dependencies to get kind of arguments. It knows about system properties and so on. Okay, so that's the command line side of things, and also in here you will find the dependency resolution part of Grails. So under the resolve package, this is where you'll find the interfaces that make up the dependency resolution engine in Grails. And the default implementation used to be, well, still is based on Ivy. But in Grails 2.3, we've added another sub-project which implements all of those interfaces, but instead with Ether. Yeah, so we have an Ether dependency manager that resolves dependencies with Ether via Maven and so on and so forth. Yeah? Yes? Sorry? From Ivy to Ether. So we made this change because a lot of people have complained to us about Ivy's semantics of dependency resolution. Ivy is okay for a lot of cases, but if you're a heavy Maven shop, or even if you're not a heavy Maven shop, if you deal with snapshots and dependency ranges or custom POMs or anything like that, Ivy has problems dealing with that. So snapshot handling, for example, in Ivy is rather broken. There's a very long part of the Grails user guide that explains why snapshot handling is broken and why it can't be fixed and how you can make it kind of not broken. But so semantically, Ivy has issues, but so we wanted to add Ether support, which would basically give us the same dependency resolution semantics as the Maven build tool. Yeah, so the same snapshot handling semantics, the same repository format, the same local repository. So it resolves to M2, your M2 repository directory, just like Maven does. So it's much closer to what you get when you're using the Maven build tool, which is, I think, what most people want in general. They just want it to work nicely with Maven repositories. And IB just doesn't really. Okay, don't do that to me now. So yeah, we basically implemented a Grails Ether sub-project which implements all of our dependency resolution interfaces, and that's the default for Grails 2.3 and above. You can still activate IB. You can still go back to IB if you want to use IB. So there's a build config setting where you can say, I want my dependency resolver to be IB. And then you can go back to IB. If you're happy with IB, you can go back to that. It's not a problem. But the default is Ether, and I think for new applications, I think it's better in general. Anyway, going back to this tour. So other things about Grails Bootstrap. In here we also have everything that relates to plugins at the command line level. So for example, there are classes in here that are capable of reading plugin information using using their AST without compiling them. Yeah. So because we need to be able to read plugin information without compiling the plugin and so forth. So there's all sorts of utility classes. If you really want to get into the guts of the Grails build system, which I don't think most of you want to, you would be looking at this project. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this project because I doubt very much most of you are interested in the guts of the Grails build system, this is what it is. What you're probably more likely interested in is the Grails core project. This is the project which defines most of the kind of common core APIs when building a Grails application. So there is a commons package, and in here you will find things like the Grails application interface. So you guys are probably familiar with this within your Grails apps. I imagine a lot of you have worked with this before. Within any Grails class, you can normally get reference to the Grails application object. It's like a global object that knows about all the conventions in Grails. Yeah, and it's pretty well documented and used. All the plugins use it, and it essentially defines an API which allows you to introspect the classes. Allows you to get reference to the application context. You can tell whether a particular class is an artifact of a Grails application. There is this notion of an artifact type within Grails. So by default, the Grails application interface doesn't know about any kind of artifact types. So when I refer to artifact types, I'm talking about things like a controller. Yeah, so the Grails application interface doesn't know about controllers. Yeah, it knows about an artifact type, and then there is a controller artifact handler, and a controller artifact handler gets registered with the Grails application object, and this makes the Grails application object know about what a controller is. Yeah, so by this we know that they come from the controllers plugin. They typically end with the controller suffix, and basically there's all sorts of meta information in here for identifying what a controller is. Yeah, does that make sense? So far, any questions? Okay, so for each, if we look at the abstract artifact handler adapter class here. If I do a tree, you'll see there are various sub-implementations, and a lot of these are related to the structure of a Grails project. If you think of a Grails project, you've got in the conf directory you've got a bootstrap.groovy. Yeah, that bootstrap.groovy is handled by the bootstrap artifact handler. You've got a Grails app/domain directory where all your domain classes live. That's handled by the domain class artifact handler, yeah, which knows about domains. You've got the Grails app/services directory. That's handled by the service artifact handler, yeah. So these artifact handlers are about telling the Grails application, we know about this convention. Yeah? And if you look at some of the plugins, if you ever get the chance to explore some of the plugins, it's quite interesting how plugins plug into Grails. For example, the Quartz plugin, a lot of you use the Quartz plugin for job scheduling, right? So that plugin adds a job artifact handler. Yeah? And the notion of a job and the fact that they live in the Grails app/job directory and that they end in job, and the knowledge about the conventions, yeah? So about what it is. So it's all pluggable within into this Grails application interface.
Grant,
Yeah.
command classes, they're not artifacts, right? Is there a reason why they're not?
Command. They're not, because like they used to be handled by the controller artifact handler, but that was in earlier versions of Grails. Now they're just completely handled by AST transforms. So there's no need to have like a custom artifact to know about them, because the transforms just deal with adding the behavior. There's no runtime introspection of command classes. Everything is done at at compile time. And I'll talk about the compile time aspect in a minute. Okay, so so far we looked at the Grails application interface. Anybody else have any questions? Other questions so far? No? Okay. So the other key interface here in this is in the plugins package, and this is where you'll find the Grails plugin manager interface. So the Grails plugin manager interface, this is essentially an interface that Grails uses to coordinate and load and configure a Grails plugin. Yeah. So there's a load plugins method, and then these various methods here are essentially to execute the various hooks within a plugin. So when a plugin loads, there are things like the do with Spring hook, where you can configure Spring programmatically, or the do with application context hook. And each of these methods relate to one of those hooks, and they orchestrate and load the plugins. Yeah. A plugin is represented by the Grails plugin interface. The Grails plugin interface defines the conventions that make up the plugin. You know, the various hooks, the on-config chains, the do with Weber scripture, the do with Spring, the various closures that make up a plugin. Yeah. So interesting to look at that area in Grails. But I'm going to move on to address that question about, because in earlier versions of Grails, a lot of configuration was done at runtime. A lot. Plugins were a lot more heavyweight in earlier versions of Grails, because we did everything via metaprogramming, like everything. Yeah. But the newer versions of Grails do a lot more AST transformation. So a lot of the behavior is added by AST. And the one particular interesting package to look at is the org/Codos/Groovy/Grails/compiler, and then under here you've got all of the base foundational classes for AST transformations in Grails. There's a Grails project compiler class, which knows how to compile a Grails project and find the necessary AST transformations. And then in the injection subpackage, this is where all of the core hooks for AST transformation exist. So there's an annotation called AST transformer, and what Grails does is it searches for all classes that have that annotation on it, and adds it as a transformation in the Grails compiler. We decided not to use Groovy global transformations. because we needed control over when they were applied and when they were not. In some cases you want these transformations applied, in some cases you not. But with global transformations, AST transforms, it's very much an all or nothing thing. You either have them all or you don't. You don't have them. You can kind of hack around it by setting system properties and saying deactivate for this property is present or something like that. But it's all a bit hacky. So we decided not to use global transforms, and all of our transformations are dealt with this annotation. And if we search for usage of this AST transformation, for example, if we go to your question about the command objects, so command objects are now handled by controller action transformer. Yeah. So this is an AST transformer. And what it does is it basically checks if a controller has a command object, and if it does, it adds logic within the body of the actual action, yeah, to new up the instance, populate it with data from the request, bind it, and so on, and then. So although in your source code it looks like it's only taking that command object, it's actually inside the method body transparently populating that value for you. And that's all happened. So you see there's logic in here to check if it's a command object action, and if it is, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because it's a whole talk by itself, just talking about AST transforms and Grails. But in terms of some more simple examples, if we look at controller transformer, this is the transformer which makes controllers able to do what they do. Yeah. So in a controller you have a render method, a redirect method. You have all these capabilities. You can get reference to the request, the params, and so on. Yeah. So the reason you can do that is because the compiler detects the controller pattern. Yeah. And if it is a controller, the source code we're looking at, then it applies the controller's API class. It weaves, it's like a mixin. It weaves that API into your controller. And the controller's API is what you actually work with. So for example, here we will find the render method. You will find the redirect method. Yeah? You will find, you'll notice that it extends Common Web API. And the Common Web API, you'll see, you've got things like to retrieve the action name, or to retrieve the controller name, to get the web request. So all the properties to get the application context, to get the server context. So these are all automatically exposed to you as a programming API, yeah, without you having to do anything. It's actually compiled in. And we're pretty excited that we've moved to this approach as well, because it's quite likely that we will be able to support really well. Previously, this was all done by metaprogramming, right? So we would modify the meta class of the controller to add the methods that we wanted. Now it's actually compiled into the bytecode, the new methods. And the reason this is a good thing is because it's quite likely that we'll be able to support static compilation pretty well. So in Groovy 2.1 and 2.0 and above, you've got compile static, the annotation. So it's still in its early phases, but we're still in exploratory phases. But it's quite likely in the future you'll be able to go to any controller and just annotate it with compile static, and it'll compile maybe with some tweaking depending on your code, but we'll be able to get it to compile and recognize things like the render method, the redirect method, references to action name, references to application context, because they actually exist in the AST, yeah, which is important. Any questions so far? Okay, so there are all sorts of AST transformers that add across the Grails code base, many of them supplied by the plugins, yeah, that add different behaviors. So for example, MIME types transformer, this one, this transformer provides the with format method, the with format method on controllers. You've got things like the converters controllers API, which allows you to do, which provides a new render method, that allows you to do render foo as JSON or render book as JSON. So this is the transformer that enables that API. Yeah. So you can imagine now that in more recent versions of Grails, the actual work that the plugin has to do is a lot less than it used to be. Previously, you know, all of this was added by runtime metaprogramming. Now it's handled by the compilation. Okay, so other interesting things in this project include in the validation package, you will find all of the APIs and the sources for constraints. So you know in a domain class when you declare constraints, or in a command object when you declare constraints, there is each one essentially represents what's called a constrained property. And a constrained property it's basically a property that fulfills one of these. It's although we have some hard-coded things like set blank, set credit card, set email, set whatever, it's actually extensible. So you can add custom constraints as well as these inbuilt ones. In terms of the inbuilt ones, we added this just because calling custom constraints is a little bit more overhead than calling non-custom constraints. And essentially, constraint property models a property of a domain class or a command object that is constrained by some validation rules. Yeah. So this is all represented and kept inside the validation package. So you'll find inside the routines. Inside this package, you'll find the actual concrete implementations. So if you want to know what happens when you say email : true in a constraint, this is handled by the email constraint. Yeah, and the email constraint, all it does right now is it delegates to Commons validator email validator for the actual logic. Yeah, so it's using Commons validator email validator. And it's checking whether value is valid. Yeah. URL constraint as well. Again, it's using Commons. Actually, I think it used to use Commons language URL validator, but we found issues with it, so we wrote our own implementation. And you got things like range constraint, nullable constraint, scale constraint, etc. All of the constraints you'll find inside this validation package. Any questions about that? At the back, yeah.
What is is password?
Sorry?
Constraint property, there's is password.
Constraint property. I think, so, you know, there's some crossover between what the view looks like and what the constraints do. So I think isPassword is basically used by scaffolding to render a password field if a particular property is a password. It's like you can tell it doesn't actually do anything from a validation sense. It just tells it's like a meta constraint, kind of like there's another one called display where you can toggle whether a property appears in scaffolding or not. So this one as well, widget is another kind of meta constraint, which you could say widget text field instead of, if you wanted a text field instead of a, it's like hints for the scaffolding rather than actual. This is like a crossover thing. I would like to actually refactor that out to be something more dynamic, so it's like dynamic properties rather than actually seeing that in there, if you know what I mean. Okay, in terms of the actual validation routine, so when you call the validate method on a domain class, what actually happens is each domain class or command object has what's known as a Grails domain class validator, and this guy implements